Hi, Barbara Manconi Smith here, and I'm going to be your host today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a founder of Health in Progress, and I'm a certified integrative nutrition and lifestyle practitioner specialized in chronic illnesses and children's nutrition. I created Health in Progress with the ambition to make health and nutritional care more accessible and to empower people with the knowledge and the tools needed to get healthy and stay healthy. And this is why we're here today. Some of you have asked me or may be wondering why I've decided to offer this free webinar on a topic that is so controversial, where notable fellow colleagues of mine don't even want to go near the V word. The main reason is that I truly believe that we all have a collective responsibility to move forward the global consciousness and share the knowledge that we have acquired over time. Because of my job and my personal interests, I became a sort of non-medical expert on the subject. And I believe, actually I know, that this is really a conversation that is needed, and it is not easy to find something as objective and unbiased as I've tried to be in this presentation. And this is really the problem that I find with the vaccine conversation. It becomes so polarized that it doesn't allow for healthy conversation. So you're either an anti-vax or a pro-vax, and people get tangled in these definitions and they lose what is at stake here, which is really the safety of our children and our family. As I said multiple times, I am not an anti-vax or a pro-vax, but I'm going to tell you what I am. I am pro-knowledge, and I'm pro-choice and pro-defending the informed consent. For this reason, I'm here today because I want to share with you a condensed study of the current complex immunization landscape with the hope that it will help some, or most of you, who may have doubts or concern, make better and more informed decisions for themselves and their family. Very quick disclaimer before we start. As you guys know, this is a very hot topic, extremely controversial and polarizing. The intent with this webinar, it is not to try to diagnose or treat any diseases, nor to try to convince anybody to be pro-vaccines or anti-vaccines. I'm here to offer all of you the opportunity to take advantage of what I've studied and found out so that you can have a better idea of what is possible and available. I would like to invite you all to do your own research. If you find any particular topic in this presentation that you are interested in, dig deeper. This is merely an overview. As you can imagine, a topic so vast can possibly be covered in 60 minutes, but it is a starting point of a solid foundation to start the conversation with your doctor, your family members and caretakers, and give you the opportunity to feel more confident about whatever decision you will make for your family. So let's dive right in. I call this webinar Navigating Immunization because immunization is more than vaccination, although sometimes the two words get used interchangeably. The Webster Dictionary defines immunity as the ability of an organism to resist a particular infection or toxin by the action of a specific antibodies or sensitized white blood cells. Contrary to popular belief, immunization is not the product of the modern society. The knowledge that underpins immunization has been evolving for more than 2,000 years. The ancient Greeks knew that people who had recovered from the bubonic plague were resistant to getting it again. Based on this observation, the authorities in Athens used survivors from the previous epidemics to nurse sufferers when the same infection reemerged. It is also known that Buddhist monks drank snake's venom to confer immunity to snake bites. During the Middle Ages, the practice of inoculating people with small amount of material from smallpox pustule, known as variolation, spread from India to China to Turkey and then into Europe and even the Americas. However, the procedure itself retained a significant amount of risk of that, and this was never widely adapted into clinical practices. In the 18th century, Edward Jenner, a British general practitioner, introduced the practice of what we know now as vaccination. This was based on the observation that milkmaids who developed a mild skin infection caused by the vaccinia virus, commonly called cowpox, were resistant to smallpox, a highly dangerous disease. Because of its success in protecting against smallpox, vaccination with cowpox became widespread, finally leading the global elimination of smallpox in the late 1970s. The purpose of immunization is to prevent people from acquiring infection, to protect them against short and long-term complication of those infections, and in some cases, to prevent the spreading of the diseases. Bear in mind, as I said, that immunization and vaccination are not the same thing. Vaccination is one of the methods used to achieve immunization. We have two major types of immunization: the innate immunity and the acquired immunity. The innate immunity is comprised of organs, tissues, and cells of the immune system that we are born with. The acquired immunity is the immunity that develops during our lifetime. The acquired immunity is divided in active immunity and passive immunity. The active immunity develops in response to an infection or vaccination, and we can have a natural immunity or an artificial immunity. The natural immunity is the antibodies developed in response to an infection, where the artificial are the antibodies developed in response to a vaccination. As far as passive immunity goes, it develops after we receive antibodies from someone or somewhere else. In the natural case, antibodies are received from our mother, for instance through breast milk. In the artificial passive immunity, antibodies are received from a medicine, for instance the immunoglobulin injection or infusion. Now, let's take a look at the marvelous process of natural immunity. Generally, a virus, like the measles for instance, is dispersed through the air by the sneezing and coughing of infected droplets and inhaled by susceptible persons in the vicinity. Through an incubation period that varies from virus to virus, the virus multiplies silently, first in the tonsil, then adenoids, then in the regional lymph nodes of the neck and head, and finally in the spleen, liver, thymus, and bone marrow, the major organ of the immune system. Meanwhile, the individual continues to feel well and exhibit little to no symptoms. By the time the symptoms appear, specific antibodies are already detectable in the blood. The disease that we know as the measles is not the virus itself, but the concerted effort of the entire immune system to expel the virus from the blood. An all-important task that requires an impressive array of collaborative mechanisms and cannot be achieved by any one or part of them in isolation. All these mechanisms are designed to help the body in completing the important tasks of attacking, destroying, removing, and finally a crucial step, which is the encryption of a permanent memory of the infection in the genetic material, so that the body is able to recognize the virus should it encounter it in the future. And this is how natural immunity is achieved. For most healthy people, the immunity conferred by this amazing process is absolutely lifelong and profoundly health-giving in two important senses. The first, because it is specific, in the obvious sense that once you do get the measles, for instance, you will not be susceptible to the virus again in your lifetime. The second aspect, that it is not often talked about, but in my opinion is even of a greater importance, is the non-specific immunity that results from having activated the whole army of immune mechanisms across the board. What this does, it primes the whole organism to respond actively to any other infections it may encounter in the future. In other words, contracting an infection like the measles, for instance, could contribute to make the whole immune system stronger and possibly prevent the contraction of other illnesses later in life. The natural immunity acquired by coming down with and recovering from acute diseases like the measles, typically characterized by fever and resulting in the expulsion of the offending virus or bacterium from the blood, represents an enormous net gain for the general health of the individuals and their descendants, and thereby the community, the nation, and ultimately of human life in the planet as a whole. So what Dr. Moskowitz is saying here is that the prerequisite of good health is the opportunity to go through formative experiences, like he calls them, such as contracting and recovering from diseases such as the measles, influenza, chickenpox, and other childhood acute illnesses. And that provides a significant protection against many chronic diseases later in life. This is pretty mind-blowing, isn't it? And so the nerd in me had to dig deeper and figure out who else was saying this. Well, first of all, my grandmother. I remember that when I was little in the 70s in Europe, it was common to host measles parties, so that once one kid got the measles or the chickenpox, All of the other kids could get them at the same time. So instead of thinking about keeping kids separated from each other, they would welcome the spread. And because of this, yours truly here got measles, chickenpox, mumps, rubella, and pertussis, and so did my cousins and a bunch of other schoolmates. In full disclosure, I was vaccinated for the measles and still got it. But are there any other scientific studies? You bet. I found a considerable body of epidemiological research that supports this diverse relationship. In one study, British scientists examined 300 women diagnosed with ovarian cancer, 300 women living in the same neighborhood, and another 300 women hospitalized for other gynecological conditions, and found that the incidence of ovarian cancer was significantly lower in women who had contracted measles, mumps, rubella, or chickenpox. Another team comparing 603 European and Israeli melanoma patients with 627 matched population control found that those who had experienced influenza, pneumonia, and indeed almost any febrile infection earlier in life were less likely to contract melanoma. Similarly, 381 adults with glioma, a type of brain tumor, were compared with 414 gender, age, ethnicity matched controls, with the result that the glioma patients were less likely to have contracted chickenpox early in life. Let's tackle now the more complex case of artificial immunity granted by vaccines. The vaccine's intention is to create a heightened immunity toward a specific disease by injecting the disease in the body with the hope to create antibodies. And I say with the hope because not every time it is successful in creating antibodies. And when it does, it is only to that particular strain that was injected. But we now know the viruses have many strains, and we also know that they mutate with time. But what every vaccine is very successful at is to create an immune response. That is the intention, in fact. And that is always an inflammatory response. The goal of vaccines, though, is to create antibodies by indiscriminately causing an inflammatory response. The problem here is the word indiscriminately. The presence of antibodies in the blood, also called humoral immunity, is an artificial immunity, but it doesn't mean that it creates innate immunity or cell immunity. But is this immunity reached by artificially pushing the body to create antibodies effective? In fact, studies show that vaccine-induced immunization falls short in creating lasting immunity, and that is the reason why some vaccines require boosts. In the recent measles reoccurrence, a very high percentage of the affected individuals were in fact vaccinated for the measles already. Now, let's take a look at what types of vaccines are available. But let's dig a bit deeper to understand how vaccines work and why some may work better than others. There are 5 main types of vaccines available: attenuated live vaccines, inactivated vaccines, toxoid vaccines, subunit vaccines, and conjugated vaccines. The live attenuated vaccines use a weakened form of the germ that causes a disease to assist in building immunity. The MMR, the chickenpox, the influenza, and the rotavirus are attenuated live vaccines. So to be clear, in these vaccines, there are still live form of the disease, and that is important to remember when we will talk about possible shedding or immune-compromised individuals. In the inactivated one, the live germs are killed with things such as formaldehyde, and an example of those are the IPV poliovirus, the hepatitis A, and the rabies. Toxoid vaccines create immunity to the parts of the bacteria that cause the disease. That means that the immune response is targeted to toxin instead of the whole bacteria. Like some other types of vaccines, you might need booster shots to get ongoing protection against diseases. The subunit vaccines use only pieces of the pathogen to provoke an immune response. Conjugated vaccines are made using pieces from the coats of the bacteria that are chemically linked to a carrier protein. This combination is used to create a more powerful combined immune response. The piece of the bacteria can cause illness, but combined with a carrier protein, it can generate immunity against future infection. Examples of the subunit conjugate vaccines are hepatitis B, influenza, pertussis, and HPV. So, as you have seen, most vaccines do not contain live viruses, but they do contain killed or specific toxic part of the germ. These species are commonly referred to as an antigen. An injection of an antigen alone will nothing more, will produce a weak immune response, is sufficient for creating long-term immunity. For this reason, they need a little bit of a boost. A big part of the vaccine controversy is related to the adjuvants. Adjuvants are immune stimulating substances that increase the immune response to the antigen so that immunity is created. So just to be clear, artificial immunity will never come close to the natural immunity that we discussed. That is the natural process that the body was designed to perform. Vaccines need adjuvants, and often these adjuvants are more harmful than the antigen itself. Let's take a look at these adjuvants, often the culprit of vaccine safety discussion. Mercury is a heavy metal and a known neurotoxin. Mercury is required by the FDA as a preservative in multi-dose vaccines. Although thimerosal was largely removed from routine infant vaccines by summer 2001 in the US, but still fully utilized in the one sent to the third world countries, but this is another conversation for another time. Still, some vaccines continue to contain non-trace amounts of thimerosal, mainly in multi-dose vaccines targeted against influenza and tetanus. Another issue with the multi-dose vials is that the heavy metals adjuvants tend to settle at the bottom of the vial, and it has been studied that whoever received the last shot of that vial receives also a greater amount of the heavy metals. And just to be clear, the use of a multi-dose vial is strictly economic, and per the CDC, each multi-dose vial saves 15 cents. Aluminum compounds are by far the most commonly used adjuvants in vaccines. It is universally accepted that aluminum is a potent neurotoxin and toxic to all life. Accordingly, the FDA has established strict limits for aluminum in the intravenous feeding solution. A significant safety problem with aluminum adjuvant is that because they are made of macroscopic particles, they can travel into the brain. Once in the brain, aluminum adjuvants cause long-term chronic inflammation. Inflammation in the brain is the cause of neurodevelopmental disorders such as autism and mental illnesses such as schizophrenia. The resulting mental illness can occur years or decades after the inflammation starts. Now, I really want you to listen carefully to what's coming next, because we're really entering the deep waters of the vaccine controversy here. Vaccines and their adjuvants' goal is to trigger an immune response, which they do well. However, given the neurotoxicity of some of the adjuvants, they also create an innate immune response to the neurotoxins present in the vaccine. At this point, since it is impossible to direct the immune response toward one element in particular, the response is indiscriminate. In particular, so for instance, if there is a peanut oil in the vaccine, the individual could all of a sudden show an allergy to peanut that it never had before. I have to say that allergies in my practice are the number one complaint that I hear from moms after vaccines, especially those who live in the states with the newly mandated vaccine schedule that decided to vaccinate all at once. One other big misconception is that the immune system goes after the heavy metals that are adjuvants in the vaccines. The immune system can only go after proteins, not metals. So what it does, it goes after the protein that the metal is attached to. It flags it and signals on it for destruction. The problem is that it may signal the same protein even when there is no heavy metal attached to it. Reaction to neurotoxins is more common than admitted by the medical community, and remember, once reactive to one neurotoxin, susceptible children or individuals become reactive to all. Another adjuvant in the vaccines is formaldehyde. It is used, as we have seen, to kill the live microorganism in the DTaP, hepatitis B, influenza, and polio vaccines. It is a potent carcinogen and a dangerous chemical that has been shown to promote other viral infections upon subsequent exposure. We also find antibiotics in vaccines that are added to influenza and polio vaccines to prevent bacterial contamination. Last but not least, the ethical conversation about biological matter. Some vaccines contain other biological matter, both intended and unintended. These include cell lines from aborted human fetuses and biological material from animal tissues. Before being killed in the vaccine manufacturing process, the virus, disease, or toxin are grown on these human and biological mediums. These fragments of cultured human tissue and animal tissue, which have also been found to include various monkey, retro, and other unintended viruses, are then injected into the muscle tissue of babies and children, along with the adjuvant intended to generate a sustained immune response to the biological matter in the vaccines. There is a study in 2012 by Colling and Fang where people who got the flu shot and developed antibodies for that particular strain of the flu, but they increased their susceptibility to all other viruses. Artificial immunity is a limited immunity because it only creates antibody towards the strain of the virus that was isolated in the vaccine. But as we know, there are many strains of one virus, and to add to the complexity, viruses do mutate, becoming more resistant. I want you to keep in the back of your mind the word susceptibility because it is key to understand the whole vaccine debate and the risk and the liabilities. What we know now is that vaccines cause, at best, a dysregulation of the immune system. And this is easy to understand, right? When you force the system in anything, it gets confused. This is not our system reacting spontaneously and naturally to a pathogen, like in the case of the natural immunity that we have discussed. This is us injecting the live virus, like in the case of the MMR, or inactivated, like in the case of the polio or hepatitis B, in order to force an immune response. As you can imagine, the system gets confused, especially when you inject multiple diseases at the same time. So the immune system throws an inflammatory response in order to clear the system. That inflammatory response can get stuck in the system so that the child gets, after vaccination, recurring and chronic ear infections or sinus infections or asthma. Some of these conditions are not recognized as vaccine injury, but what I'm discussing here is the possibility that recurrent or chronic conditions are the result of a vaccine dysregulated immune system. In 1986, Congress passed the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, NCVAI, in response to calls by the pharmaceutical industry. American Academy of Pediatrics and other medical trade groups to shield drug companies and doctors from civil product liability and malpractice lawsuits for injuries and deaths caused by federally recommended and state-mandated vaccines. The law, which acknowledged that vaccine can cause injuries and deaths, created a federal vaccine injury compensation program. As explained by the Institute of Medicine, IOM, the litigation costs associated with claims of damage from vaccines had forced several companies to end their vaccine research and development programs, as well as to stop producing already licensed vaccines. And this is when all started. Instead of letting market forces compel vaccine makers to create safer vaccines, Congress granted pharmaceutical companies financial immunity from injuries caused by vaccines recommended by the CDC. By granting immunity from actual or potential liability from injuries caused by the vaccines, Congress eliminated the market forces that are generally relied upon to ensure the safety of all the other products. So, if it's not the manufacturer's responsibility, who's responsible to make sure that vaccines are effectively safe? The United States Department of Health and Human Services, also known as the HHS. HHS is responsible for research to prevent adverse reaction to vaccines, develop the techniques needed to produce safe vaccines, testing of vaccines, monitoring adverse reactions, and shall make or assure improvements in the licensing, manufacturing, processing, testing, labeling, warnings, use instruction, distribution, storage, administration, field surveillance, adverse reaction reporting in order to reduce the risks. So what I just said very fast, not to bore you, guys, is that in the 1986 Act, it was created a system in which vaccines are monitored, licensed, recommended, encouraged, subsidized, and defended by the same agency, the HHS, in charge clearly of many conflicting duties. Since the passage of the 1986 Act, the number of required pediatric vaccines has grown rapidly. In 1983, the CDC's childhood vaccine schedule included 11 injections of 4 vaccines. As of 2017, the CDC's childhood vaccine schedule included 56 injections of 30 different vaccines. Although with the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986, doctors and all vaccines providers are protected from any vaccine injury lawsuit, doctors and healthcare providers are still required to report possible adverse reactions. But unfortunately, not many do. There are no legal sanctions for pediatricians or other vaccines providers who fail to obey the federal law and do not report serious health problems following vaccination to federal health officials, do not provide written vaccines risk-benefit information to parents or patients before vaccines are given. How many of you have ever received the manufacturer's risk leaflet? And do not record vaccine-related adverse events in the permanent medical records. It is estimated that sadly only between 1 to 10% of all serious health problems, hospitalizations, injuries, and deaths that occur after vaccinations given to children or adults are even ever reported to the Federal Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. Instead of reporting to federal health agency responsible for monitoring vaccine safety, most pediatricians and vaccine providers are either not reporting at all or sending vaccine reaction reports directly to vaccine manufacturers, essentially creating a big crack in the system. There are over hundreds of regularly reported injuries by parents. In 2011, the Institute of Medicine looked at science that convincingly supports a causal relationship for 18 of these serious injuries, including pneumonia, meningitis, hepatitis, deadly brain inflammation a year after vaccination, febrile seizures, and anaphylaxis. For the remaining ones, the Institute of Medicine concluded that there wasn't enough literature, meaning not enough studies, to conclude a causal relationship. But what the Institute of Medicine review have consistently acknowledged is that there is individual susceptibility to serious vaccine injuries. And guys, this is key and pivotal. They didn't say that there was no link. What they said is that there was not enough research done. However, what they did agree to is that their individual susceptibility after the vaccine administration plays a huge role in the development of the injury. In fact, for this reason, the Institute of Medicine urged that research should be encouraged to elucidate the factors that put certain people at risk. And although today, still no studies have been done, despite IOM recommendations, to assess these individual susceptibilities to try to predict accurately who are the individuals who could have an adverse reaction, the IOM in 2013 found evidence that children with a family history of autoimmune diseases or allergy or children born prematurely may potentially be susceptible to adverse reaction to vaccines. And continues noting that some of these adverse reactions are specific to the particular vaccines, while others may not be. Some of these predispositions may be detectable prior to the administration of vaccines. But much work remains to be done to elucidate and to develop strategies to document the immunologic mechanism that lead to adverse effects in individual patients. We are all born with genetic weaknesses, some inherited, some that happened to us when we were in utero, and this is why it's so important for women who are pregnant or thinking about starting a family to detoxify. We're exposed to toxins, stressors that turn on genes, GMO, vaccines, pesticide, neurotoxins, environmental toxins. Our gut microbiome. We know that there is a direct relationship between the gut and the brain, since most of the neurotoxins pass the blood-brain barrier and sets in the brain. At this point, we should ask ourselves, we're doing all this to protect people from contracting infectious diseases, but who's protecting the people who are harmed in the process? Is the life of a child or an adult harmed by a vaccine less important than the life of a child or an adult harmed by an infectious disease? Inflexible implementation of one-size-fits-all vaccine mandates places a disproportionate and unequal risk burden on those individuals who are biologically, genetically, or environmentally at higher risk for suffering harm from vaccination. Let's talk about vaccine safety review, meaning how does the CDC know that the vaccines that they are recommending are indeed safe? All non-vaccine drugs licensed by the FDA undergo long-term multi-year double-blind safety studies during which the rate of adverse reactions in group receiving the drugs under review is compared to the rate of adverse reaction in a group receiving the inert placebo, such as a sugar pill or saline injection. Lipitor's pre-licensure trials lasted a median of 4.8 years and controls received a sugar pill. Botox pre-licensure trials lasted a median of 51 weeks and control received a saline injection. And even with these long-term studies, drugs are still often recalled. Another thing to consider is while most drugs like the ones above are given to sick adults, pediatric vaccines are typically given universally to healthy baby and toddlers. Unfortunately, unlike all non-vaccine drugs licensed by the FDA, vaccines are not required to undergo long-term double-blind inert placebo-controlled trials to assess safety. In fact, not a single one of the clinical trials for vaccines given to babies and toddlers had a control group receiving inert placebo. Further, most pediatric vaccines currently on the market have been approved based on studies with an inadequate follow-up period of only a few days or weeks. For example, there are 2 hepatitis B vaccines licensed for 1-day-old babies because in the United States, babies get the hepatitis B just a few hours after they are born. One manufacturer is the Merck and the other is GlaxoSmithKline. Merck's hepatitis B vaccines were licensed by the FDA after trials with only 5 days follow-up control. Similarly, GlaxoSmithKline's hepatitis B vaccine was licensed by the FDA after only 4 days follow-up after vaccination. Follow-up period of 4 to 5 days are not nearly long enough to detect possible adverse effects such as an autoimmune or neurological disorder, seizures, or death. Worse is that since neither of these clinical trials used a control group, it was impossible to scientifically determine if any adverse reactions were occurring at all. The Vaccine Injury Compensation Program has paid to date nearly $4 billion in federal compensation to children and adults who have been injured or died from federally recommended and state-mandated vaccines, even though 2 out of 3 applicants are denied federal compensation. This means that probably the injuries are far more than the ones just recognized and paid. So to recap, we are in a situation where government has recognized that vaccines can cause injuries in susceptible individuals, failed to undergo studies to be able to predict who these individuals are, and still shields manufacturers and pediatricians for any possible lawsuit due to proven and paid for injury due to vaccines. This is an updated map of the U.S. state vaccine law and exemption. We have 3 types of exemption: philosophical, religious, and medical. Every state must have a medical exemption to protect those vulnerable individuals who, for medical reasons, can be vaccinated. Few states still maintain all of the exemptions, but the majority has only the religious and the medical exemption. A religious exemption is a provision in the state law which allows parents to exempt their children from the school vaccine requirement if it contradicts parental religious or spiritual belief. A philosophical exemption is a provision in the state law which allows parents to exempt their children from the school vaccine requirement if it contradicts parental belief beyond those considered religious or spiritual belief. Parents can ask for a medical exemption if a vaccine wouldn't be safe for their child. Reasons that children can get an exemption include they have a disease or take medicines that weakens their immune system, they have a severe allergy to a vaccine or an ingredient in it, they had a serious reaction to a vaccine in the past. To get a medical exemption, parents need to have their child's doctor sign a form. Many states ask whether the exemption is temporary or permanent, and almost half of the states require doctors to sign a new form every year or so. Right now, California, New York, Maine, West Virginia, and Mississippi have revoked all the exemption except for the medical exemption. This means that in these states, you can no longer exercise your philosophical or religious exemption. And let me add that the state's legislators will make it harder and harder for people to get even the medical exemptions. Starting in 2020 in California, for instance, the Department of Public Health will review all medical exemptions of doctors who write more than 5 medical exemptions per year, and all the schools whose vaccination rate falls under 95%. With this in mind, and for those of you who are following us outside of the US, I would like to throw this in here. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. First Amendment of the United States Constitution. And since I'm on a roll with the quotes, I would like to add this food for thought as well. All too will bear in mind this sacred principle that though the will of the majority is in all cases to prevail, that the will to be rightful must be reasonable, that the minority possess their equal rights, which equal laws must protect, and to violate would be oppression. And that was Thomas Jefferson. And in lieu of the recent mandates, the conversations are shifting now, not anymore as much on vaccine safety that in theory should be the focus, but whether or not the states and the government overall should and can take away the freedom of voluntary decision. The informed consent principle has guided the ethical practice of modern medicine since the mid-20th century. Informed consent means that an adult or parent of a minor child must be given complete and accurate information about the benefits and risks of a medical procedure or pharmaceutical product, be free to make a voluntary decision about whether or not to take the risk, and not be subjected to harassment, coercion, or sanction for making an informed, voluntary decision about that risk. But why are the state legislators hitting so hard on vaccine mandates? Because of the recent measles outbreaks. Measles is the most transmissible disease known to man. The vaccine was introduced in 1963 when the recurrence of infection was already decreasing organically due to the herd immunity that we will discuss shortly. Since so many people like myself contracted and recovered from the disease, that created a natural immunity. However, during the 80s, the number of measles cases in the United States rose dramatically. Why? Because the vaccine was not effective. In response, the United States adopted a 2-dose universal measles immunization program. What will be known as the measles paradox is that 20 to 40% of these cases occurred in persons who had been appropriately immunized against the measles. Measles research scientists have for a long time been aware of the measles paradox. Poland and Jacobson found in their famous study that in every outbreak, a sensible percentage of the people who contracted the disease were vaccinated individuals. And quote, the apparent paradox is that as measles immunization rates rise to high levels in a population, measles become a disease of immunized persons. And they continue saying that because of the failure rate of the vaccines and their unique transmissibility of the measles virus, the currently available measles vaccine is unlikely to completely eliminate measles. Further research determined that behind the measles paradox is a fraction of the population called low vaccine responders. Low responders are those who respond poorly to the first dose of the measles vaccines. These individuals then mount a weak immune response to subsequent revaccination and quickly return to the pool of susceptibles within 2 to 5 years, despite being fully vaccinated. It has been documented that vaccinated people who develop breakthrough measles are contagious. In fact, the 2 major measles outbreaks in 2011 in Quebec, Canada, and in New York were re-imported by previously vaccinated individuals. Taken together, this data make it apparent that elimination of vaccines exemptions currently used only by a small percentage of families anyway, will neither solve the problem of disease resurgence nor prevent reimportation and outbreaks of previously eliminated diseases. The majority of measles cases in the recent US outbreaks, including the Disneyland one, were adults and very young babies, whereas in the pre-vaccination era, measles occurred mainly between ages of 1 and 15. Natural exposure to measles was followed by lifelong immunity from reinfection, whereas vaccine immunity wanes over time, leaving adults unprotected by their childhood shocks. On top of that, it has been proven that measles is more dangerous for infants and for adults, think about pregnant women, than for school-age children. In other words, we simply don't know what the rules are to inducing long-lasting immunity. For years, we were making vaccines without a really deep knowledge of immunology. Everything, of course, depends on immunological memory, and we have not systematically measured it. Stanley Plotkin, vaccinologist. One thing that I want you to have clear is the distinction between recommendation and legal mandates. There is a difference between federal vaccine policies and the state vaccine laws. Federal public health officials at the Center for Disease Control make national vaccines policy recommendations for children and adults. With the approval of state legislators, public health officials in state health departments make and enforce vaccines mandates. That is why vaccines laws and legal exemptions to vaccination vary from state to state. In other words, CDC recommends and the states create the laws. Vaccines mandates enforce what and how many vaccines a child must get to attend daycare and school, as well as for adults to perform certain type of job. I want to stress this differentiation because oftentimes doctors and health providers coerce uninformed parents to vaccinate their children under the false pretense of a mandated vaccine when it is simply recommended. And I'm sure that you have seen at your doctor's office or in school plenty of advertising and marketing material that pressure you to get vaccinated and vaccinate your children using vague lingo that could hint at the fact that by law you must vaccinate your children, what in reality they strongly recommend it. Let's talk now about another hot topic, the herd immunity. Per the CDC, a situation in which a sufficient proportion of a population is immune to an infectious disease through vaccination and/or prior illness to make it spread from person to person unlikely. Even individuals not vaccinated, such as newborns and those with chronic illnesses, are offered some protection because the disease has little opportunity to spread within the community, also known as herd immunity. So the preservation of the herd immunity is what is fueling the new legal mandates. And that fact that unvaccinated children pose a health risk to the rest of the public. But do they? Let's talk about immune-compromised children first. Do unvaccinated children really pose a higher threat to immune-compromised children? And this is what the ACIP, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, recommend. Killed or inactivated vaccines do not represent a danger to the immune-compromised people and generally should be administered as recommended for healthy persons. Live vaccines, like the MMR, should not be administered to severely immunocompromised people. For them, immunoglobulin is indicated to prevent measles following exposures. For those of you not familiar with the ACIP, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, this is a committee within the CDC that provides advice and guidance on effective control of vaccine-preventable disease. So, what they are suggesting is that for immune-compromised people, immunoglobulin provides immediate short-term protection against hepatitis A and measles infection. Immunoglobulin contains antibodies taken from donated human blood. Infants, as well as other vulnerable or immune-compromised individuals, are eligible to receive immunoglobulin, a potentially life-saving measure that supplies antibodies directed against the virus to prevent or ameliorate disease upon exposure. If you have decided not to vaccinate your child, then you know that you are or will be under a great deal of pressure and bullying at your doctor's office, at schools, and even among your friends who see your child as a possible threat to the health of their children. But do unvaccinated children really pose a higher threat to the public than the vaccinated ones? I found the explanation given by Dr. Tatiana Bukanich, a mom and a very vocal Harvard immunologist, the most direct and logical one. Let's see what she has to say. Most of the CDC recommended vaccines cannot prevent transmission of disease, either because they are not designed to prevent the transmission of infection, rather they are intended to prevent disease symptoms, or because they protect from non-communicable disease. What does this mean? And you may want to take notes here so that you are able to respond confidently to such pressure. IPV, inactivated poliovirus vaccines, cannot prevent transmission of poliovirus. Why? Because the vaccines who supported the eradication of the disease was not the IPV currently administered, but was the wild poliovirus vaccine. But since the wild poliovirus has been non-existent in the US for at least 2 decades, it is no longer administered. Even if wild poliovirus were to be reimported by travel, vaccinating for polio with the current IPV cannot affect the safety of public spaces, and non-IPV vaccinated children pose no threat. Tetanus is not a contagious disease, but rather acquired from deep puncture wounds contaminated with C. tetani spores. Vaccinated for tetanus via the DTaP combination vaccine cannot alter the safety of public spaces. It is intended only to render personal protection only. Hence, unvaccinated children do not pose a higher threat. While intended to prevent the disease-causing effects of the diphtheria toxin, the diphtheria toxoid vaccine, also contained in the DTaP vaccine, is not designed to prevent colonization and transmissions of C. diphtheria. Vaccinated for diphtheria cannot alter the safety of public spaces. It is likewise intended for personal protection only. The Acelera pertussis AAP vaccine, the final element of the DTaP combined vaccines now in use in the US, replaced the whole cell pertussis vaccines in the late 90s, which was followed by an unprecedented resurgence of whooping cough. An experiment with deliberate pertussis infection in primates revealed that the AAP vaccine is not capable of preventing colonization and transmission of the B. pertussis. The FDA has issued a warning regarding this crucial finding. In 2013, the CDC revealed additional alarming data that pertussis variants currently circulating in the US acquired a selective advantage to infect those who are up to date with their DTaP boosters, meaning that people who are up to date with their DTaP vaccines are more likely to be infected and thus contagious than people who are not vaccinated. In other words, what all this means is that the DTaP vaccine may protect you against the undesirable effects of the disease, but not against transmitting it to other people. Just like the vaccines that can shed, people are still contagious, and unvaccinated children do not pose a higher threat. Hepatitis B is a blood-borne virus. It does not spread in a community setting, especially among children who are unlikely to engage in high-risk behavior such as needle sharing or sex. Vaccinating children for hepatitis B, especially a 1-day-old, cannot significantly alter the safety of public spaces. Further, school admission is not prohibited for children who are chronic hepatitis B carriers. To prohibit a school admission for those who are simply unvaccinated and do not even carry hepatitis B would constitute unreasonable and illogical discrimination. In summary, a person who is not vaccinated with IPV, DTaP, hepatitis B, and influenza vaccines due to reasons of caution poses no extra danger to the public than a person who is, so no discrimination is warranted. It may not come to much surprise that the United States is the country with the highest amount of scheduled vaccines in the world, and early in life. Some countries have even banned vaccines for children younger than 6 months and pregnant women. Right now, 49 doses of 14 vaccines before age of 6 are administered or scheduled. And if you think that these are a lot, you should know that currently there are thousands of new vaccines in clinical trials. New vaccines are being developed for infectious and non-infectious disease. Among these, obesity, tooth decay, anti-smoking, some of this will become state mandated. As the number of federally recommended and state-mandated vaccinations have increased during the past 3 decades, there's also been a corresponding increase in direct cost for parents, health insurance companies, and taxpayers. Specifically, the cost to vaccinate a child with all federally recommended vaccines in a private pediatrician's office increased from $80 per child in 1982 to more than $2,900 per child in 2017. And one would think that the more vaccinated the population, the healthier it should be, right? Wrong. As the number of scheduled vaccines has risen, so have the rates of common childhood diseases, including ADD, ADHD, SIDS, and asthma. Before the 70s, ADD and ADHD were not even prevalent enough for a diagnosis to exist. The first related diagnosis came out in the 80s. The number of children and adults that have been prescribed ADD and ADHD drugs has skyrocketed over the past decades, and asthma rates have also experienced a sharp rise over the years. According to Harris Coulter, a medical historian and scientist, SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, was not reported in the statistics before the rise of mass vaccination because of its rarity. As vaccination rates have risen, so have SIDS rates. When Japan put a moratorium on all vaccination before the age of 2, their SIDS rate plummeted to almost nothing. Although they are every bit as scientifically adept as we are and highly technologically advanced, their schedule has less than half the recommended vaccination as the United States. And right now, the United States is the country with the highest incidence of SIDS in the world. But let's go back to Japan for a second to get some perspective. In 1994, Japan transitioned away from mandated vaccination in public health centers to voluntary vaccination into doctors' offices, guided by the concept that it is better that vaccinations are performed by children's family doctors who are familiar with their health conditions. The country created 2 categories of non-compulsory vaccines: routine, vaccines that the government covers and strongly recommends but does not mandate, and additional voluntary vaccines generally paid for out of pocket. Unlike in the US, Japan has no vaccine requirements for children entering preschool or elementary school. Japan also banned the MMR vaccine at the same time due to thousands of serious injury over a 4-year period, producing an injury rate of 1 in 900 children. That was over 2,000 times higher than the expected rate. So just to recap, Japan has no vaccine mandates. Japan does not vaccinate newborns with the hepatitis B unless the mother is hepatitis B positive. Japan does not vaccinate pregnant mothers with the tetanus, diphtheria, axillary pertussis. Japan does not give flu shots to pregnant mothers or to 6-month-old infants. Japan does not give the MMR vaccine. Japan does not require the HPV vaccines. And with a population of 127 million, Japan has the healthiest children and the very highest healthy life expectancy in the world and the least vaccinated children of any developed country. As a mother, I know it's a tough decision, one we will need to live with every day. Whether we decide to vaccinate, to skip few, or all of them together, we will have to live with the consequences. And I refer particularly to our role as parents, because we're called to make decisions for them. We can decide for ourselves whether a flu shot is worth the risks, but our children and our pets have no voice, and that makes it all more difficult. But my hope with this webinar is that you gain some knowledge and a better understanding of the processes, the legalities, and your rights. But I understand that although I try to pack this webinar with as many information as I could possibly fit in, it doesn't even come close to be exhaustive, and that you may still have some questions. If I decide to vaccinate, what can I do to limit risks? Or if I decide to partially vaccinate, which vaccine should I consider? Or is there an alternative to vaccines to protect my children against infectious diseases? How can I exercise my religious or philosophical exempt? Is homeschooling an option for my family? I'm pregnant. What are my best options? What can I do if I suspect my child is being vaccine injured? Can my vaccine injured child be detoxed? For this reason, and for those of you who want actionable insight on what to do next, I created a Navigating Immunization Masterclass, the action plan for your family, where I will guide you to build an action plan for whatever is your ultimate decision. A safe space where you will be able to learn, ask, and act accordingly. You will receive information that have not been shared or written publicly before for obvious reasons that you will understand. That could make a huge difference in how you or your child will react to a vaccine. Yes, there are ways to minimize risks. There are ways to still get protection and not get affected. And wholeheartedly, yes, there is so much that you can still do if you suspect that your child has been vaccine injured. And I'm not talking about autism. I'm talking about more subtle signs from asthma to ADHD to neurological and autoimmune issues. We will talk about whether the medical medium protocol fits in and how to recognize possible susceptibility. We'll also go in depth onto what to do if you're pregnant and thinking about starting a family soon. You will hear from notable scientists and experts in the field, and you will learn powerful ways to protect your family whether you decide that vaccine immunization is for you or not. The information will be yours to keep forever. You will be able to download script letters to exercise your philosophical or religious exemption. You will receive talking points to be able to answer people who are questioning your choices with valuable fact and science-based information. This masterclass is not only the opportunity to educate yourself, but to have on-hand material and information to educate the people around you and be confidently supported while you're doing so. As mentioned at the beginning, this is not an anti-vax propaganda. I do not support that, but I do support information, choices, and people's informed decision, and I've dedicated my whole career to do that. For those of you who may question why there is a cost associated with this masterclass, I'm sure it is obvious and understandable, but for complete transparency, I want to add that in order to create this webinar, I took 3 weeks off from my daily work. This means that I wasn't able to produce any income that my family relies on for sustenance, but I know that the information in this masterclass are so vital that I decided to take even more time off, a substantial amount, I would say, to make all this information available to you. This is what I wished I had found before becoming a mother, and I would have paid double for it. Your contribution will enable me to continue to dedicate my time to support you and your family in making decisions that, as you know, not many people are willing to openly discuss. I could have decided to talk about adrenals or emotional detoxins, but I'm sure you have enough of this. I'm taking a risk that not many people are willing to take in doing so, and for these reasons, I really hope you will appreciate my dedication and consider to join me. This masterclass could be exactly what you need to fill the knowledge gap and make an informed decision that will put your heart at ease one way or another. Because I created this webinar only for those of you in my medical medium group, I also wanted to give you the option to sign up earlier before anybody else and an increased discount. So if you sign up today, you will only pay $199 instead of $250, and you will also be able to download the transcript of this webinar. In this masterclass, you will receive 3 videos plus 1 bonus of interviews that will give you a detailed information about what to do if you decide to vaccinate, what to do if you decide not to vaccinate, immunization during pregnancy, how to prepare before starting a family, how to detoxify your child if you suspect possible vaccine injury, what is possible and what is not possible from a legal perspective, alternatives to vaccine immunization to protect your family, and much more. You will receive extra documents to download, including templates of the letters to use if you decide to exercise your religious exemption, a guidance on where and how to report an injury. You will receive exact measures to take days before getting the shots, at the appointment, and the days after to minimize the risks, things that you will not hear anywhere else. Ultimately, whether you decide to join the masterclass or not, I want you to take away that it's up to you to take your children's well-being into your own hands, nobody else. So lose the fear, get informed, get empowered with the knowledge you need to activate your intuition. You can do your research Take your masterclass and get all the information you need, because remember, nobody loves your children as much as you do. So don't let them make these important decisions for you. If you have questions, wait and get your information first until what you decide feels right. Remember, knowledge is power that nobody can ever take away from you. As long as you have knowledge, you will always have a choice.